A dream everyone wants. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing you're living inside a sentence people whisper with envy. She married a billionaire. It sounds like a finish line, doesn't it? Like the moment when effort ends and comfort begins. For years, maybe even for you, that sentence has carried a quiet promise that if love meets money, life finally becomes easy. 3 weeks ago, in the United States, that sentence was my reality. And this story begins exactly there. Not with pain, not with conflict, but with a dream that looked complete from the outside. You see, dreams rarely announce their expiration date. At first, everything felt beautifully arranged. The house was large but quiet, the kind of quiet that sounds expensive. The refrigerator was always full. The calendar was always planned. Even the air felt controlled, like nothing bad was allowed to happen here. From the outside, it looked like success. From the inside, it felt like arrival. And maybe that's why so many people chase this version of love. Because deep down, many of us believe that security will calm the nervous system. That money will silence fear. That stability will finally let us rest. Psychology actually explains this very well. When basic needs are threatened, the brain becomes obsessed with safety. That's why financial stability feels so emotionally powerful. It promises relief. It promises peace. But here's the part no one tells you. The brain doesn't stop needing connection once safety is achieved. It simply moves the goalpost. In the first days of our marriage, I noticed how often people smiled at us differently. How conversations shifted. How advice stopped and admiration began. It was subtle, but it mattered. When the world treats your relationship like a trophy, you start performing instead of relating. Inside the house, our conversations were polite, efficient, calm. We talked about schedules, logistics, plans. We rarely talked about feelings. Not because we were avoiding them, but because everything seemed fine. And that word, fine, is one of the most dangerous words in a marriage. From a learning perspective, this emotional atmosphere did something interesting to me. My motivation to practice English changed. I still listened. I still read. I still spoke. But something felt flat. Language, like emotion, needs friction to feel alive. When everything feels perfect, expression becomes unnecessary. I would listen to English conversations around me, slow, clear American English, and understand every word. But understanding didn't equal connection. The words entered my ears, but they didn't land anywhere meaningful. This is important if you're learning English right now. Motivation doesn't disappear because you're lazy. It disappears when your emotional system feels disengaged. Studies in neuroscience show that learning is strongest when emotion is present. Curiosity, tension, desire, these activate memory. Comfort alone does not. At that stage of my life, comfort was abundant. Meaning was not. And yet, I didn't question the dream. Most people don't. When something looks good on paper, we silence the quiet discomfort. We tell ourselves we should be grateful. We tell ourselves this is what winning looks like. But emotional truth doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It waits. This section isn't about regret. It's about honesty. Because before any transformation, there is usually a phase where everything looks right and feels strangely empty. And if you've ever felt that way, successful but disconnected, stable but unmotivated, your brain isn't broken. It's responding exactly as designed. The dream everyone wants is rarely the dream that teaches us the most. That comes later. The first quiet cracks. Cracks never announce themselves with noise. They arrive silently, like dust settling on a shelf you pass every day. You don't notice it until one morning the light hits just right, and suddenly you see how much has been collecting there. The first cracks in my marriage didn't come from arguments. They came from pauses. Long pauses. Imagine asking someone how their day was, and receiving a perfectly accurate answer that somehow told you nothing. Not a lie. Not avoidance. Just a summary so efficient it left no room for feeling. At first, I admired that. Efficiency felt adult. Mature. Successful. But the human nervous system doesn't bond through efficiency. It bonds through shared attention. In those early weeks, our home ran smoothly. Too smoothly. Meals happened on time. Conversations happened on schedule. Even affection seemed planned. A hug before leaving. A kiss before sleep. Nothing wrong. Nothing missing. Except something was missing. Psychologists call this emotional attunement, the ability to sense and respond to another person's inner state. When attunement fades, relationships don't explode. They cool. And cooling is harder to detect than fire. I noticed it in small moments. Standing in the kitchen, listening to the hum of expensive appliances, I felt oddly alert. My body wasn't relaxed. It was waiting. For what, I couldn't say. But waiting itself is information. When the nervous system stays on standby, it's usually sensing emotional unpredictability, even if the surface looks calm. This internal tension followed me into my English practice. I'd sit with my headphones on, listening to slow American English stories. Clear pronunciation. Simple sentences. And yet, my attention drifted. Not because the content was boring, but because my emotional energy was being spent elsewhere. Cognitive science explains this simply. Attention is a limited resource. When emotional questions remain unanswered, the brain keeps returning to them. You can't fully focus on learning when part of your mind is scanning for connection. This is why many learners feel stuck without knowing why. It's not about intelligence. It's not about discipline. It's about unresolved emotional load. One evening, I tried to name what I was feeling. Lonely felt too dramatic. Sad felt inaccurate. The closest word was unmet. Not neglected. Not rejected. Just unanswered. That's when I realized something important. Money had removed struggle, but it had also removed friction. And without friction, intimacy couldn't deepen. We were gliding over the surface of life, never pressing into it. Even our children sensed it. They asked fewer questions. They stayed in their rooms longer. Children don't analyze emotional climates. They absorb them. When the air feels thin, they breathe more quietly. That night, I didn't study English. I didn't force productivity. I sat with the discomfort instead. Because ignoring it hadn't worked. Here's the lesson hiding inside this phase. If your motivation to learn English suddenly fades, don't immediately blame yourself. Ask what else is asking for your attention. Emotional needs don't disappear just because life looks successful. Cracks don't mean failure. They mean information. And information, when listened to early, can change everything. When money replaces presence. There's a strange moment that happens when money starts doing emotional labor for people. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly steps in, fills the gaps, and convinces everyone that nothing else is needed. Picture this: a problem appears, and instead of a conversation, a solution is purchased. Attention rises, and instead of sitting with it, a distraction is arranged. A feeling wants attention, and instead of being heard, it's smoothed over with comfort. At first, this feels like care. In our marriage, money became incredibly efficient. If I was tired, help appeared. If the house felt heavy, we changed the environment. If time felt tight, schedules were optimized. On the surface, it looked like support. And technically it was. But presence is not the same as support. Presence requires something money cannot provide: attention without agenda. Psychology calls this emotional availability. It's the ability to be with someone's inner experience without trying to fix it. And here's the uncomfortable truth: when money can fix things quickly, the muscle for presence weakens. I noticed this during conversations. I would begin to share something small, a feeling, a doubt, a moment of confusion. The response would come quickly. Logical, helpful, complete, and emotionally unfinished. The conversation would end, but the feeling wouldn't. This pattern affects learning more than people realize. When your emotional experiences aren't mirrored, your brain stays alert. Not anxious, alert. It's waiting to be seen. And an alert brain doesn't absorb new language easily. So when I sat down to practice English, my body was there, but my mind was split. I could repeat sentences. I could understand vocabulary. But my voice felt thin, unanchored. Language needs grounding to feel real. Neuroscience explains that when we feel emotionally witnessed, the parasympathetic nervous system activates. This is the state where learning deepens. When presence is missing, the nervous system stays slightly activated, functional, but not receptive. That's exactly how life felt. Functional. Not nourishing. Even silence changed. Silence used to feel peaceful. Now it felt transactional. A pause between tasks. A space filled with invisible expectations. One night, after the children were asleep, I realized something quietly devastating. We were physically together, but emotionally outsourced. Money had taken over the role of patience, listening, and repair. And money, for all its power, is terrible at those jobs. This realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with clarity. The kind that doesn't shake you, but reorients you. Here's the practical insight for you, especially if you're learning English through stories like this. If you want your English to feel alive again, start paying attention to where your emotional presence has been replaced by performance or solutions. Learning isn't just repetition. It's engagement. And engagement requires presence, with yourself first. Try this small exercise. The next time you listen to English, don't aim to understand everything. Aim to notice what you feel. Confused? Curious? Tired? Interested? Naming that emotion grounds your nervous system, and grounded systems learn faster. Money can buy comfort. It can reduce friction. It can remove obstacles. But it cannot sit with you in uncertainty. And presence, real presence, is where both love and language actually grow. Love inside a luxury home. Luxury has a sound. It's soft, muted, almost padded. Doors close quietly. Floors don't creak. Even problems seem to walk on tiptoe. From the outside, a luxury home looks like peace. From the inside, it can feel like emotional insulation, thick enough that nothing sharp gets through, including honesty. Our house in the US was beautiful in a way that didn't ask questions. Every room had space. Every object had a purpose. There was nothing to fix, nothing to complain about, nothing obviously wrong. And that was the problem. Love doesn't grow well in environments where nothing is allowed to be messy. I noticed how carefully we moved around each other. Not out of fear, but out of politeness. We respected schedules. We respected boundaries. We respected privacy. What we didn't do very well was interrupt each other's inner worlds. In smaller homes, people collide. They overhear. They notice moods because there's no place to hide them. In a large house, emotional distance becomes effortless. You can avoid without meaning to. You can miss things without choosing to. Psychologically, this creates what researchers call parallel living. Two people sharing space but not experience. It's common in high-functioning marriages, especially where stress is solved externally instead of processed internally. And here's the subtle danger. Parallel living feels calm. Until it doesn't. I remember walking past the children's rooms one evening. The doors were closed. Not slammed. Just closed. Inside, they were quiet. Too quiet. Children usually fill space with sound when they feel safe. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes it's adaptation. That moment stayed with me. Later that night, I tried to practice English again. I chose a slow story. Clear American pronunciation. Short sentences. Easy vocabulary. On paper, perfect practice. But my voice sounded distant even to me. I was reading words, not inhabiting them. Language mirrors life. When life feels compartmentalized, language does too. You speak, but you don't resonate. You listen, but you don't connect. This is why so many adult learners say, "I understand English, but I don't feel confident speaking." Confidence doesn't come from correctness. It comes from emotional alignment. From feeling present in your own voice. In that house, presence was diluted by space. Science backs this up. Studies on attachment show that emotional closeness is built through microinteractions. Small, frequent moments of shared attention. Not big conversations. Not dramatic gestures. Just noticing and responding. Luxury reduces friction. But friction is where microinteractions live. That realization didn't make me want less comfort. It made me want more contact. So I started doing something very simple. I practiced English out loud in shared spaces. Not to show off. Not to perform. Just to exist audibly. Sometimes the children would listen. Sometimes my partner would comment. Sometimes nothing happened. But something changed. Sound returned to the house. And with sound came unpredictability. And with unpredictability came life. Here's the takeaway for you. If your learning feels flat, don't immediately change the method. Change the environment. Learn where life happens. Where interruptions occur. Where someone might hear you. Language, like love, deepens when it's lived, not perfected. A luxury home can protect you from discomfort. But growth, emotional and linguistic, needs just a little mess. And that mess, it turns out, is where connection hides. Children feel it first. Children don't need explanations. They read the room the way your skin reads temperature. Instantly, silently, accurately. Long before adults name a problem, children adjust to it. I noticed it in the smallest behaviors. Fewer questions at dinner. Longer pauses before answering. More time alone, even when no one asked for it. Nothing dramatic. Nothing alarming. Just a quiet recalibration. That's how children protect themselves, by becoming easier. In our home, no one raised their voice. No one argued loudly. No door slammed. And yet, something emotional was missing. The children felt it before I fully did. They stopped interrupting. They stopped asking asking for attention at inconvenient moments. They learned the emotional rules without being told. Psychologists call this emotional scanning. Children constantly monitor the emotional availability of adults. When availability feels limited, even subtly, they reduce their needs to maintain stability. It looks like maturity. It's actually adaptation. This realization hit me harder than anything else. Because children don't need perfect parents. They need present ones. I started noticing how often their conversations sounded careful. How they checked my face before continuing a story. How they shortened sentences if I looked distracted. These are survival skills, not communication skills. And this matters deeply, not just for family but for learning. Children learn language through emotional safety. Adults do too. We just forget that part. When I practiced English around them, something interesting happened. My tone softened. My pace slowed naturally. I explained words instead of rushing through them. I wasn't performing anymore. I was sharing. That's when my English started feeling human again. Research shows that teaching or explaining activates deeper learning pathways. When you speak for connection, not evaluation, your brain integrates language more fully. Children create that environment instinctively. They don't judge. They listen for meaning. One evening, one of the kids asked me why I was speaking English so slowly. I said, "Because I want my words to arrive." That sentence stayed with me. So many of us speak to finish, to prove, to pass. Very few of us speak to arrive. In families where emotions are managed instead of expressed, children become quiet experts at reading between lines. But language doesn't live between lines. It lives in expression. That night, I made a small change. I began narrating my actions, in English. Slowly. Simply. Not as a lesson, but as presence. I'm tired. I'm thinking. I need a minute. The children responded immediately. More questions. More sound. More life. Here's the insight for you. If your English feels blocked, ask yourself where you've learned to be quiet emotionally. Where you've learned to minimize. Language mirrors those habits. You don't need confidence. You need permission to take space with your voice. Children remind us of that before anyone else. They always feel it first. Marriage becomes a contract. There's a moment in some marriages when love quietly changes jobs. It stops being a living relationship and starts behaving like an agreement. Not because people stop caring, but because caring gets organized. Schedules replace spontaneity. Responsibilities replace curiosity. Conversations become updates instead of discoveries. No one announces this shift. It just settles in. That's when marriage begins to feel like a contract. In our case, everything was fair, balanced, efficient. We divided tasks logically. We respected each other's time. We honored commitments. From the outside, it looked like a healthy partnership. Inside, it felt strangely transactional. Contracts are excellent at preventing chaos. They are terrible at creating intimacy. Psychologically, this happens when people prioritize predictability over presence. Predictability reduces anxiety, but presence builds connection. When anxiety is low and presence is absent, relationships drift into management mode. I noticed how often we said things like, "That makes sense," instead of, "How did that feel?" One responds to logic. The other responds to humanity. And humanity doesn't thrive on logic alone. This dynamic affected my inner world more than I expected. I became careful with my words. Precise. Measured. Even in English, my sentences felt negotiated instead of expressed. I spoke to be correct, not to be understood. Many adult English learners fall into this trap without realizing it. They treat language like a contract too. Grammar rules. Correct forms. Safe expressions. Everything approved. Nothing alive. But language, like marriage, needs risk. Neuroscience tells us that emotional risk activates learning. When you allow yourself to sound imperfect, your brain engages more fully. When you play it safe, the brain stays shallow. I saw this clearly one afternoon while practicing English. I was repeating sentences perfectly. Pronunciation clean. Grammar correct. And yet, I felt bored. Disconnected. My nervous system wasn't involved. That's when it clicked. I had turned both marriage and language into systems to manage, not experiences to live. So I tried something uncomfortable. I spoke English without planning the sentence first. I let myself pause. Search. Restart. It felt messy. Vulnerable. Alive. That same evening, I did something similar in my marriage. I asked a question without knowing where it would go. I didn't aim to resolve anything. I just stayed. That's when the contract loosened. Here's the takeaway for you. If learning English feels mechanical, ask yourself where you've learned to prioritize safety over expression. Fluency doesn't come from control. It comes from participation. Marriage doesn't fail when people stop loving. It fades when love stops being curious. And language is exactly the same. Loneliness in a perfect life. Loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from being surrounded by people and still feeling unseen. That kind of loneliness is confusing, because nothing is obviously missing. And when nothing is obvious, you start questioning yourself instead. That was the hardest part. From the outside, my life looked complete. Stable marriage. Financial freedom. Healthy children. A beautiful home in the US. It checked every box people are told to chase. And yet, There was a quiet sense of isolation that followed me through the day, like background noise you only notice when everything else goes silent. Loneliness inside a perfect life feels illegitimate. You tell yourself you shouldn't feel this way. You minimize it. You rationalize it. And in doing so, you push it deeper. Psychology has a name for this: emotional invalidation. When your feelings don't match your circumstances, you learn to distrust them. Over time, this creates disconnection, not just from others but from yourself. I noticed how often I stayed busy, not because I had to, but because stillness made the loneliness louder. Productivity became a shield. Structure became protection. Even learning English turned into something I used to avoid: silence. I listened constantly. Podcasts, stories, slow American English videos. The sound filled the space, but it didn't fill the gap. Here's something important for you as a learner. Language cannot replace connection, but it can reveal where connection is missing. When I listened to English stories about love, family, or struggle, I felt a strange ache. Not because I didn't understand the words, but because I did. The meaning landed too close to home. Neuroscience explains this through mirror neurons. When we hear stories, our brains simulate the emotions inside them. That's why stories feel personal, even when they aren't about us. And when our own emotions are unexpressed, stories bring them forward. Instead of avoiding that feeling, I started using it. I paused the audio. I repeated sentences that resonated. Slowly. Out loud. Not to practice pronunciation, but to acknowledge emotion. I feel distant. I don't know why. I want more. Those sentences weren't in any textbook. But they mattered more than perfect grammar. Loneliness lessened when I named it. That's the paradox. The moment you allow loneliness to exist, it loses some of its power. Suppressed emotions isolate us. Expressed emotions reconnect us. At home, I began sharing small truths. Not accusations. Not demands. Just observations. I feel quiet lately. I miss laughing. I feel far, even when we're close. Nothing dramatic changed overnight, but something softened. And softness creates space. For you, if you're learning English while feeling emotionally tired or disconnected, don't ignore that state. Use it. Let English become a tool for expression, not escape. Speak the sentences that feel true, not just the ones that sound correct. A perfect life can still feel lonely. But loneliness, when listened to, becomes a doorway, not a dead end. Losing motivation, losing voice. Motivation doesn't disappear like a switch turning off. It fades the way a radio signal fades when you drive too far from the station. At first, the sound is still there, just a little fuzzy. Then certain words drop out. Then whole sentences. And eventually, you're sitting in silence, wondering when the music stopped. That was exactly how my relationship with English, and with myself, felt. I didn't quit. That's important. I showed up every day. I pressed play. I listened to slow American English. I repeated sentences carefully. On the surface, I looked disciplined, consistent, serious about learning. Inside, though, my voice felt like a guest that had overstayed its welcome. I spoke only when necessary. I chose sentences that were safe, neutral, almost invisible. Not because I lacked vocabulary, but because expressing myself felt emotionally expensive. Every sentence carried weight, and silence felt cheaper. Psychology calls this emotional withdrawal. It often happens when repeated expression doesn't lead to connection. The brain learns a simple rule: speaking doesn't change anything, so conserve energy. That rule doesn't feel dramatic. It feels practical. And that's why it's dangerous. I noticed how this pattern mirrored my marriage. When I stopped expecting emotional response, I stopped offering emotional content. Conversations became functional, efficient, correct, just like my English. Neuroscience shows that voice is deeply tied to identity. When you speak freely, you activate areas of the brain associated with self-concept and agency. When you restrict speech, those areas quiet down. Over time, this creates a subtle disconnection from your own inner life. That's when learning becomes mechanical. Many adult English learners think their problem is vocabulary or grammar. But often, the real issue is permission. Permission to sound unfinished. Permission to take up space. Permission to say something that hasn't been polished yet. I didn't realize how much permission I had revoked from myself until one quiet afternoon. I was practicing English alone, reading a simple paragraph out loud. Halfway through, I stopped. My voice sounded flat. Not wrong, just absent. So I did something different. I stopped reading. And I spoke without text. Slowly. Imperfectly. Honestly. I feel tired today. I don't know what I want. I feel quiet inside. The sentences were simple, childlike, even. But my body reacted immediately. My breath changed. My shoulders dropped. My jaw relaxed. That wasn't motivation returning. That was safety. From a scientific standpoint, this makes sense. When you speak something emotionally true, the nervous system shifts toward regulation. And a regulated system learns better, faster, deeper. That moment taught me something crucial. Motivation doesn't come from pushing harder. It comes from feeling allowed. Allowed to pause. Allowed to search for words. Allowed to sound unsure. So I built a new rule for myself. English practice was no longer about improvement. It was about presence. I spoke slowly on purpose. I let silence exist between sentences. I repeated phrases not to memorize them, but to feel them land. Sometimes I didn't finish thoughts. Sometimes I changed direction mid-sentence. And something unexpected happened. My voice came back. Not louder. Not more confident. But more mine. At home, this change spilled over. When your voice feels welcome in one area, it seeks expression everywhere. I shared more small truths. I spoke before I was certain. I allowed emotional drafts instead of finished speeches. Here's what I want you to take from this, especially if you're learning English and feel stuck. If your motivation is gone, don't chase it. Sit with your voice instead. Ask where it learned to be quiet. Ask when speaking started to feel unsafe or pointless. Then do the opposite, gently. Speak one true sentence a day. In English. Slowly. Out loud. Not for correctness. Not for fluency. For recognition. Your brain doesn't need pressure. It needs permission. Losing motivation is rarely about laziness. It's about a voice that hasn't been heard in a long time. And once you invite that voice back, carefully, patiently, it remembers how to speak. When silence becomes a habit, silence doesn't arrive suddenly. It arrives politely. It waits its turn. It lowers its voice so you don't notice it taking up space. One day, it's just a pause. The next day, it's a pattern. And eventually, it's a personality. By the time I realized silence had become my habit, it had already been promoted to leadership. It decided when I spoke, how much I shared, and which emotions were allowed to exist out loud. It framed itself as wisdom, as emotional control, as maturity. People even praised it. You're so calm. You're so composed. What they didn't see was how much energy it took to maintain that calm. Silence isn't empty. It's heavy. It presses inward. Psychologically, silence often begins as a coping mechanism. When your environment feels unpredictable, emotionally, relationally, or socially, your nervous system searches for stability. Silence offers that. It reduces risk. It minimizes exposure. It keeps things manageable. The problem is that the nervous system doesn't know when to stop. Once silence works, the brain keeps using it, even when the danger is gone. In my marriage, silence showed up during small disagreements. Not the explosive kind. The quiet ones. The ones where you sense something is off, but decide it's not worth bringing up. The brain loves that logic. Fewer conflicts. Less emotional cost. Temporary peace. Temporary becomes permanent very easily. Over time, my internal dialogue got louder while my external voice got quieter. I rehearsed conversations in my head that never happened. I explained myself to imaginary listeners. I resolved arguments alone. That's when silence crosses a line, from protection into isolation. This pattern mirrored itself in my English learning. I could listen for hours. I could read complex, emotional stories. But speaking felt optional, risky, unnecessary. My vocabulary grew. My confidence shrank. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Silence trains your brain to believe your thoughts don't need witnesses. And language, any language, exists to be witnessed. Neuroscience tells us that emotional expression activates different neural networks than silent processing. When you speak, especially about feelings or opinions, you engage areas related to memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and social bonding. Silence keeps everything locked inside the same loop. That's why long-term silence feels stagnant. Nothing moves. The first crack in this habit didn't come from a big moment. It came from frustration. I remember thinking, I know what I want to say. Why won't it come out? That question changed everything. Instead of blaming English, I looked at behavior. I wasn't practicing expression. I was practicing restraint. So I redesigned practice, not around fluency, but around permission. Permission to sound unsure. Permission to pause mid-sentence. Permission to add, I feel, even when it felt unnecessary. At first, my body reacted as if I was doing something wrong. My shoulders tightened. My breathing shortened. That's the nervous system resisting change. It mistakes unfamiliarity for danger. But here's the secret most people miss. Discomfort is often a sign you're interrupting an old habit, not creating a new problem. I started small. I narrated my thoughts out loud when alone. In English. Not perfectly. Just honestly. I'm tired today. I don't like how that felt. I'm unsure. Those sentences weren't impressive. They were alive. Slowly, silence lost its grip. It stopped being automatic and became optional. And that's the goal, not to eliminate silence, but to reclaim choice. Silence chosen is peace. Silence automatic is a cage. If you're learning English and feel stuck despite understanding everything, consider this possibility: your language isn't blocked. Your voice is resting behind a habit. Break it gently. Add one extra sentence when you speak. Add one feeling word when you answer. Stay 2 seconds longer before you stop talking. That's how habits loosen, not with force, but with persistence. Silence taught me how to survive. Speaking taught me how to live. And fluency, real fluency, started there. Learning to speak without permission. At some point, you realize the real problem isn't silence. It's permission. Or more accurately, waiting for it. Most of us don't consciously think, I need approval to speak. But our behavior says otherwise. We wait for the perfect timing. The right tone. The clear signal that it's safe to open our mouths. And when that signal doesn't come, we stay quiet and call it patience. It feels polite. It feels controlled. It feels mature. But underneath, it's fear wearing good manners. I noticed this in myself during ordinary moments. Conversations where nothing dramatic was happening. No conflict. No tensión. Just space. And yet I waited. For a nod. For encouragement. For someone else to go first. That habit didn't come from nowhere. Psychology calls this learned inhibition. When speaking up in the past led to dismissal, misunderstanding, or emotional withdrawal, the brain quietly marks expression as risky. Not dangerous, just inconvenient enough to avoid. So you learn to read the room too well. You monitor faces. You calculate reactions before sentences are finished. You censor yourself in real time. Your mouth waits for your nervous system's approval. The cost of this shows up in language learning brutally fast. You know the words. You understand the grammar. You even rehearse answers internally. But when it's time to speak, your mind asks a different question. Not is this correct? But is this allowed? That's not a language issue. That's a permission issue. I remember a moment when this became painfully clear. Someone asked me a simple opinion question. Not personal. Not emotional. Just an opinion. And I froze. Not because I lacked vocabulary, but because I was unconsciously scanning for safety. Would this create friction? Would it change how they see me? Would it be worth it? By the time my brain finished negotiating, the moment had passed. Silence won again. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. Waiting for permission is a habit that keeps reinforcing itself. The more you wait, the less permission you feel you have. So I tried something different. I spoke before I felt ready. Not recklessly. Not aggressively. Just early. I answered before my internal committee finished debating. I allowed sentences to come out imperfect. I interrupted my own hesitation. The first few times felt wrong. Almost rude. My body reacted with a spike of adrenaline, as if I'd broken a rule no one had clearly stated. That reaction is important. It means you're stepping outside conditioning. Neuroscience explains this as prediction error. Your brain expects negative consequences from speaking without permission. When those consequences don't happen, the prediction weakens. Over time, the fear loses credibility. But only if you act. I practiced this deliberately in English. When asked a question, I responded immediately, even if the sentence was simple. Even if I planned to improve it later. The goal wasn't eloquence. It was presence. Something shifted. My voice stopped sounding tentative. My sentences became longer, not because my vocabulary grew overnight, but because I stopped cutting myself off. Permission moved from external to internal. And here's the strange part. People responded better. Conversations flowed. Misunderstandings decreased. Not because my English was perfect, but because clarity beats caution. This applies beyond language. In relationships, in work, in everyday life. When you wait for permission, you often miss connection. When you speak honestly, even imperfectly, you create it. If you're learning English and feel stuck despite knowing enough, try this experiment. Stop asking yourself if it's okay to speak. Assume it is. Speak first. Edit later. Express now. Refine tomorrow. Fluency doesn't come from correctness. It comes from courage repeated often enough that fear gets bored. Silence taught me restraint. Speaking taught me agency. And once agency arrived, English stopped feeling like a test and started feeling like a tool. Letting children hear the truth. Children don't need perfect parents. They need honest ones. That sentence sounds comforting, but living it is uncomfortable, especially when you've spent years filtering your words, polishing your emotions, and hiding uncertainty like it's a contagious disease. For a long time, I believed silence was protection. If my children didn't hear the tension, the doubt, the arguments whispered behind closed doors, then maybe they'd grow up lighter, cleaner, unburdened. But silence doesn't disappear. It relocates. Kids don't need explanations to sense emotional weather. They red tone the way sailors read clouds. When something feels off, they don't ask what's happening. They ask, is it my fault? Psychologists call this emotional attribution. When children lack information, they invent it. And their invented stories are rarely kind to themselves. I learned this the hard way. One evening, after a long day that had nothing dramatic about it, no yelling, no crisis, my child asked a quiet question: did I do something wrong today? That question landed heavier than any argument ever could. Nothing had happened. And yet, something had. They felt the distance. The unspoken tension. The emotional economy we adults think we manage so well. That night, I changed one small rule. I stopped hiding everything. Not oversharing. Not trauma dumping. Just truth, age-appropriate, emotionally honest truth. I'm tired today. I'm thinking a lot. Sometimes adults feel confused too. Simple sentences. Clear tone. Noblam. What surprised me wasn't their reaction. It was mine. Speaking truth out loud slowed my nervous system. My voice softened. The room felt more stable, not less. It turns out honesty regulates, not destabilizes, when done with care. There's solid science behind this. Studies on emotional regulation show that labeling feelings reduces amygdala activity, the brain's threat center. When you name emotions calmly, the brain stops guessing. Safety increases. Children benefit from this twice. They learn emotional vocabulary. And they learn that feelings aren't emergencies. This matters deeply for language learning. When children hear adults speak honestly, even imperfectly, they learn that language isn't about performance. It's about connection. They stop waiting for flawless sentences. They start valuing meaning. I began practicing English this way too. Instead of hiding behind silence when words felt insufficient, I said things like, "I don't know the perfect word, but I'll try." This sentence might be wrong, but the feeling is real. That vulnerability changed the dynamic instantly. Conversation stopped being a stage. It became a shared space. Children mirrored this faster than adults ever could. They spoke more, asked more, made mistakes without apology. Their English didn't improve because of drills. It improved because fear left the room. And here's the paradox. When emotional honesty increases, structure follows naturally. Kids listen better. Conversations last longer. Trust deepens. The same applies to marriage. Avoiding truth doesn't keep peace. It postpones repair. In relationships, silence often masquerades as maturity. But unspoken feelings don't age well. They ferment. They leak sideways. They show up as sarcasm, withdrawal, exhaustion. When I began naming small truths early, before resentment had time to sharpen, conflict became shorter and less dramatic. I feel disconnected today. I need reassurance, not solutions. I'm overwhelmed, not angry. Those sentences are simple. Their power is not. They prevent emotional debt. And that's the skill language learners rarely practice: emotional precision. Not advanced vocabulary, accurate intention. You don't need complex grammar to say something real. You need courage and clarity. If you're practicing English, try this with yourself or your family. Speak one honest sentence a day. Not impressive. Not polished. Just real. Watch what happens. Children relax. Conversations deepen. Your voice steadies. Language becomes less about avoiding mistakes and more about being understood. And when understanding becomes the goal, fluency follows naturally. Truth spoken gently doesn't harm children. Silence spoken loudly does. The quiet answer that changed everything. There's a moment that doesn't look important while it's happening. No dramatic music. No big argument. No sudden realization that hits like a movie scene. It's just a quiet answer to a question you've been asking for weeks. For me, that question was simple. What actually heals emotional pain? Not what distracts it. Not what decorates it. Not what hides it behind comfort, money, or success. What heals it? After 3 weeks of living inside this story, inside wealth, family routines, marriage conversations, children's questions, and my own hesitant English, I realized the answer wasn't something new I had to add. It was something old I had to stop avoiding. Presence. Not luxury. Not explanations. Not perfect communication. Presence without armor. Money had solved many problems. Time problems. Safety problems. convenience problems. But emotional pain? It didn't disappear. It simply became quieter, more polite, harder to name. And when pain becomes quiet, people stop listening. That's the dangerous part. Psychology calls this emotional numbing. When the nervous system learns that feelings won't be responded to, it turns the volume down. You function. You smile. You succeed. But you don't feel fully inside your life. Language learning suffers in the same way. You know English. You've studied. You've watched videos like this one. But something feels blocked, not intellectually, but emotionally. Your voice doesn't fully arrive. Your sentences stay cautious. That's not because you're bad at English. It's because you've learned to protect yourself from being seen. What changed things for me wasn't a new method. It was a small decision, to show up imperfectly and stay. To finish sentences even when my grammar lagged. To name emotions even when the words felt too simple. To listen without planning my reply. My children noticed first. They leaned in more. Asked deeper questions. Corrected my English casually, without fear. Language became play again. My partner noticed next. Conversations softened. Fewer assumptions. More curiosity. Conflict stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like information. And then I noticed. English stopped feeling like a performance. Life stopped feeling like a checklist. Healing didn't arrive loudly. It arrived steadily. Science backs this up. Long-term emotional repair happens through co-regulation, safe, consistent connection with others. Not intensity. Not drama. Just reliable presence. That's why this video isn't about becoming fluent fast. It's about becoming available to your voice, your feelings, your story. If you take one thing from this entire journey, let it be this. You don't need better English to express your life. You need to let your life enter your English. Speak before you feel ready. Name emotions without overthinking. Let your children hear truth. Let yourself be heard, even when it's messy. That's how language sticks. That's how confidence grows. That's how empty spaces fill, not with money, but with meaning. If this story resonated with you, don't let it end here. Save this video. Share it with someone who's learning English and quietly struggling. And subscribe, because there are many more real stories like this coming. Not everyone wakes up after living inside a dream. Some people stay there for years, long enough to forget what they once wanted beyond comfort. Some have enough money to buy time, yet don't know how to use that time to listen to themselves. And some, like me, only realize their heart feels empty after everything looks complete. If you're still watching, you're probably not just learning English. You're listening to something inside you that you've been avoiding for a while. Maybe you're living a life others would call successful. Maybe you're in a relationship that isn't bad, just no longer warm. Or maybe you practice English every day, yet deep down you know something is missing. Something vocabulary alone can't fix. The real question isn't, can money fix emotional pain? It's this: if money can't heal it, are you brave enough to face what comes next? In the next video, I'll share the part most people never talk about. What happens after you start telling the truth, to your partner, to your children, and to yourself. And why that's the moment your English begins to improve faster than any method you've tried. If this story resonated with you, save this video. You may need to hear it again, more slowly one day. Share it with someone who's learning English and quietly struggling. And subscribe, because real stories like this are just getting started. Sometimes what you need to learn isn't a new language. It's how to use your own voice again. See you in the next video.